No natural phenomenon can be adequately studied in itself alone, but to be understood it must be considered as it stands connected with all of nature. Now that was Sir Francis Bacon in the 17th century. And about 100 years later, born in Lanarkshire in the Scottish lowlands, was John Hunter, for whom Bacon might as well have been creating the motto with those words, because what Hunter devoted his life to was to recognize the position of humankind within all of the species of the earth.
John Hunter was born in East Kilbride, Scotland, which is on the outskirts of Glasgow. He was one of 10 children. His older brother, William, who was 10 years older, had moved to London and established himself as a successful surgeon when John Hunter's father died when John was age 13. He was briefly apprenticed to a carpenter, and then he worked for a short time with a physician in the area.
But he didn't do the formal apprenticeship, which was common in those days. And really that was probably to his benefit, because it made him think for himself. And that's how Hunter differed from all the other surgeons of his time. He believed that all surgery should be founded on scientific evidence. So he questioned every current practice. He challenged every mode of thinking, and he experimented in order to find out what actually did work. And I don't believe he would have done that if he'd gone through the traditional apprenticeship where pupils were learnt to revere what their masters told them and to copy them exactly. But Hunter also was a fantastic teacher, because he taught his own pupils exactly that same doctrine. So he taught them to think for themselves, which I think is an absolutely fantastic legacy, and it is still obviously best practice in medical education today.
He didn't like school much and would spend time observing nature and the phenomena around him of plants and animals. Eventually, his brother William suggested that he come to London and work with him, and immediately why he found his life's occupation.
He absolutely hated books, despised all reading, and was quite probably dyslexic. So he left school at the age of 13, and that was the end of his formal education. His most important training, however, was with his brother William. He came down to London when he was 20 years old and worked with William in his anatomy school in Covent Garden. So John Hunter spent 12 years working alongside his brother, and to begin with he was obviously learning the trade, learning about the body from his brother, but very quickly John became as knowledgeable and more knowledgeable than William, his older brother.
When he was a younger man, he studied fauna and flora of all sorts. He was, one might say, the originator of the study of comparative anatomy by physicians, because his idea of learning anatomy was to begin with simplest forms, then gradually get to man, this very complex form. And so to do this, he did, at the height of his career, let it be known that he was willing to buy a leopard or a tiger or a wolf, whatever was available.
Perhaps he was one of the first veterinarians. At Earl's Court, he had a real menagerie. He would pick up a leopard, one in one hand and one in the other, and actually could lift them up. So he learned a lot about living animals, comparative anatomy, and also how to take care of their maladies, just like he was taking care of his patients.
So he came back to London, began working in the anatomy department, at school actually, and at St. George's Hospital. You have to recognize what surgery was like at that time. Surgeons were essentially craftsmen. They were poorly educated. They had no position in society that was worth anything. Well, along comes this middle-class young man, rough as an uncut diamond, and determines that it's not enough to learn how to do these operations. It's important for him to know why we are doing these operations. It's important for him, for example, to figure out how healing takes place. Well, we all know today that healing takes place as a result of the process of inflammation, which we understand microscopically, physiologically, biochemically, but at that time no one knew anything about inflammation. So he began a lifelong study of the process of inflammation. Imagine a surgeon, ordinarily people who just did operations, never thought about anything else, essentially setting up a laboratory of his own to study wound healing. And this resulted in one of his great books, his study of inflammation.
And then he came back to London and he set up on his own in private practice. Now that was quite a slow beginning at first because it was very hard to get established on the professional hierarchy in London. But he quite soon managed to establish a reputation as a surgeon. And after, by about the 1780s, he was one of the most popular, if not the most popular surgeon of his time.
John Hunter was a good friend of Captain Cook, and in fact nominated Captain Cook for the Royal Society. He would get Cook to bring back specimens from his various travels, and he even tried to get Jenner to go on a trip with him for 5 years, but Jenner's wife objected. One of the people who he wanted to go was an ancestor of mine, John Sheldon, and John Sheldon did go on a trip and was supposed to bring a whale back. He brought back a flipper of a whale, which enraged Hunter, and he was basically dropped from his group of students. Of interest, John Sheldon actually became the successor to William Hunter's school and took it over after he died, and he became well known and actually trained some of the surgeons that eventually wound up on the faculty at Columbia University.
His practice wasn't successful at one time, and so therefore he joined the military. And he went as a surgeon to Belle Isle, just off of France, during the French-English War at that time. But there he did in his typical way. He evaluated the flora and the fauna. He also studied gunshot wounds. In fact, he wrote, many years later, this book, Blood, Gunshot Wounds, and Inflammation, with a lot of the information coming from that war at Belle Isle.
On mustering out of the service, he returned to London to find that he no longer had a position with his brother William, so the start of some of their estranged relationship, and he began to do studies on his own. He opened his own anatomical school, and one of the first things he did on approaching that was to study teeth. And he wound up doing teeth transplantation, implants, which are now in vogue again, and he wrote the first textbook on dentistry.
He was perhaps the first odontologist. His interest in teeth, and the classification we use today is the same one that John Hunter uses his nomenclature. He wrote 4 books, and one of these was on the teeth, probably the hardest book to get because so many dentists and anatomists are interested in these books. He also transplanted teeth, brand new teeth coming from one human to another.
Hunter took out normal teeth from healthy young men and women to implant into wealthy ladies' jaws. He probably gave these people a guinea for a tooth, you see. You want a guinea? Yes, I'm going to put out. He said, now, imagine how much money you would accept if I said, I'm going to put out one of your teeth without an anaesthetic. $50,000? No, thank you.
When he first came to London to set up on his own after working in the army, John Hunter worked alongside dentists. And at that time, that was a very lowly thing to do. Dentists were seen as pretty much the bottom of the medical tree, even below surgeons and barber surgeons. So John Hunter was quite sort of criticised for working with dentists. But partly that was to bring in some money, because there was always a need for good dentists. Partly he was interested in the dentistry as a research project, and so he actually produced his first first book was a treatise on dentistry, which described in comprehensive detail all the anatomy of the jaw and the teeth, and really was the first of its kind in the English language.
There are a number of sort of maudlin stories about John Hunter. You know, Anne Hunter, his wife, was writing music and playing music in the front of the house in the tea room. And in the back of the house was a dissecting room with students and other surgeons. And basically where he got these bodies was from sack-em-up men, as they called it. They were from grave robbers. Some of these people had just died that day and then were brought to John Hunter that night, having transcended the grave. So he sort of had a dual personality, sort of like Jekyll and Hyde.
When he began dissecting, he would often work late at night, and he got into the habit of doing what were essentially jumping jacks. He would jump up and down and clap his hands over his head to relieve the tedium at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And one morning he was doing this, and he felt this tremendous snapping sensation, an enormous pain in the Achilles tendon of his heel. And what he had done, he had broken the Achilles tendon. It had just torn. Well, what an opportunity for John Hunter to use himself as an experimental subject to study the healing process. He began to take a series of animals and making a small pinhole near their Achilles tendons, a dog, for example, or a cat, he would cut the tendon and after a period of time, sacrifice the animal and then dissect the tendon and see how the healing had taken place, all the while comparing it to what was happening in his own body. So he was in many ways the father of what we call auto-experimentation, using himself.
So what was this inoculation experiment? Hunter described in his book that he took venereal matter from a man with VD and inoculated the glans penis, made a little incision, a little scratch, took this matter and put it into the scratch, and said that the subject, first of all, got the obvious discharge of gonorrhea, and then subsequent to that, the patient got an obvious chancre, which is the ulcer of syphilis, and then went on to get the secondary manifestations of syphilis, so-called secondary syphilis, the rash and the glands and so on and so forth. Why did he do this experiment? There were two schools of thought in those days. The strong school of thought, which Hunter supported, which we know is quite wrong, is that an organ cannot get two diseases. The other theory would be, well, each disease has got its own particular manifestation if it affects a particular organ. Of course, I hasten to say this was, let me think, Hunter 79. This was 100 years before Pasteur showed the bacterial nature of infection, and Koch showed specific organisms produce specific disease.
The friendship between John and Anne Hunter and the Austrian composer Joseph Haydn is memorable on a number of reasons. Haydn first came to London in 1791, and he went to John and asked his opinion on his nasal polyps. And perhaps if I quote Haydn what happened afterwards, he said, "A few brawny fellows entered the room, grabbed me, and wanted to force me into a chair. I yelled, kicked, and hit until I had freed myself, and made clear to Mr. Hunter, who already had his instruments ready for the operation, that I did not want to undergo it. It seemed to me that he pitied me for not wanting to undergo a happy experience of enjoying his skills."
One of the best stories illustrating John Hunter's pursuit of scientific information is the story of the Irish giant, variously called John Byrne or Brian.
Now, of course, in our time, someone who was 8 feet 2 inches tall would probably buy himself a pair of sneakers, an athletic supporter, and go off and become a professional basketball player. But there was no basketball in those days. There was something equivalent where a young man could make a lot of money. There were traveling circuses and fairs. So he went to London thinking to exhibit himself. But before he went there, one of his friends, a fellow named Joe Vance, decided to become his agent. And Joe Vance set him up in rooms in London near one of the museums and sent out posters and billboards and flyers about this great man. And they began making a lot of money. But in time, of course, the money made this farm boy into a drunkard because he had no notion of how to live in London. So he would spend every night drinking. He may have taken some drugs. Who knows what he was doing at that time. But he would end up, not infrequently, at 3 or 4 in the morning, picked up drunk in the gutter. Well, this is no way to live. And by the time he was in his late 20s, he'd gotten very sick, probably with tuberculosis, almost certainly with tuberculosis. And realizing that he was going to die within a period of perhaps 6 months or a year, and realizing also that the great surgeon of the time, John Hunter, was very keen to get his body to dissect it.
Hunter tracked him all over the British Isles, attempted to persuade him to donate his body to his anatomical museum. The Irish giant was horrified at the prospect and hired morticians to put his body in a lead casket after death and then drop it in the Irish Sea.
Well, of course, Hunter was smarter than that, knew who the undertaker was, and for a significant amount of money bribed the undertaker.
And on notification that the Irish giant was dying, he ran in his transom, in his carriage across London, was able to secure the body, allegedly put a broom handle down the back of the coat so the person would be upright in the cab, and by next morning the specimen was prepared and in his anatomical museum where it resides today.
And to this day, if you see that giant in the Royal College of Surgeons Museum, you'll notice that the bones are a little dark because of the rapidity of the boiling process.
John Hunter performed an operation in December 1785, which was a classic example of his way of working. In that month, a coach driver, came into St George's Hospital suffering from an aneurysm in the popliteal artery behind his knee, which is quite a common thing with coach drivers at the time. So there were only really 2 options at that time. One was to amputate the leg, which was very dangerous, quite often led to people dying in the operating theatre or afterwards from infection. Or he would have just had to leave it and would probably have died when the aneurysm burst. Now Hunter had already tried various ways of trying to cure the aneurysm before. So he had tried cutting into the artery above and below the aneurysm and tying these. But that had never actually worked because the collateral circulation had never actually formed properly.
He ligated the artery, the popliteal aneurysm, in what we call now Hunter's Canal, in the thigh, obstructing the artery in a sound part of the artery, and owing to the collaterals that had developed, the leg remained viable. And of course, he was able to follow this patient, and a number of years later he died of a pneumonia, and he was able to examine the specimen and the collateral channels.
As Hunter established his practice, one of his first patients was Benjamin Franklin, who immediately saw him for an illness that reared its ugly head while he was in transit in the 55 days from colonial America. They became friends, and Franklin also participated with Hunter in a group, an informal mentoring group of American students who came to study in London and Edinburgh and eventually went on to found most of the first 5 medical schools in the United States.
He was very loyal to his pupils, and he had many pupils, many disciples. Some of the great surgeons of the following generation were his pupils. Astley Cooper, in the next generation, the leading English surgeon, was one of his leading pupils. Well, he was loyal to those people. When he was about 63 years old, in the year 1793, no, he was 65 in the year 1793, he was at a board meeting at St. George's Hospital, the same sorts of board meetings that we have today. And the discussion was about whether to give what we now might call hospital privileges to 2 of his pupils. And he got into this, as usual, violent discussion with several people who disagreed about these young men. And in supporting them, he got angrier and angrier, suddenly felt this enormity of crushing chest pain, rushed out of the room, fell into the arms of a physician who was nearby, right outside the room, and died of angina, died of coronary, a massive coronary. Well, of course, for many years and for decades, historians said, well, he died of syphilitic heart disease. He died of aortic valvular disease associated with syphilis. But we know from the autopsy that was done, looking back on it now, that what he died of was ordinary coronary occlusion. And so indeed, he was the victim. His life was in the hands of lesser people who chose to annoy him.
John Hunter died in 1792, demanded in his will that an autopsy be performed, which was done by Sir Everard Home, and it documented coronary artery occlusion as his cause of death. He was interred at St. Martin's in the Fields. 66 years later, he was then reinterred in Westminster Abbey, where he is the only surgeon buried and so acknowledged in that wonderful place.
John Hunter was an amazing man. He was an amazing man in his time, and also would have been just as amazing now. So many accomplishments in so many areas: surgery, comparative anatomy, dentistry, even looking at the electricity generated by a fish, the torpedo fish. He dissected animals. He dissected human bodies. And then he took all these applications into ultimate good for patients and to a firm understanding of our natural history. So I think you can consider him really the father of scientific surgery and maybe many other scientific things.
I think in many ways, though, his greatest contribution is the over 1,000 known students that he had. He probably had many more that populated the breadth and depth of Western civilization, and in the United States founded first 5 or 6 universities that developed medical schools. And this will be, in many ways, his lasting contribution.
Students, you should definitely go to John Hunter's time capsule, the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons of England. It's a time capsule sent from John Hunter to us today, well over 200 years later. The dissections, the experiments that he did, the animal specimens, animals, some that are extinct today. You'll learn so much not only about the man, but how he thought, something that can be applied to us today as we develop new innovations in medicine and surgery and new technology.
John Hunter taught probably around 1,000 pupils, and some of those came from all over Britain, all over Europe, and several came from America too to study under him because his name was so well known. They included William Shippen, John Morgan, and Philip Singh Physic, and the first two in particular came back to America and set up a dissecting school themselves, very much in the Hunter model. And basically they introduced Hunter's theories, Hunter's doctrine of scientific surgery to America.
Although Hunter died years before the Royal College was founded, the Royal College of Surgeons is a direct lineal descendant of the Company of Barber Surgeons, of which Hunter was a member. His memory at the Royal College of Surgeons is honored by the Hunterian lectures that are given every year. In fact, I was able to give one this year, as I am a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of England, as is Dr. George Sheldon, who's also a fellow of the college. Few Americans have given these lectures, but they are given to honor Hunter's memory as the father of scientific surgery.
And it's no wonder that the great lecture of the Royal College of Surgeons is the Hunterian lecture. So that every year, when that lecturer stands on the podium, he has hanging behind him that magnificent Joshua Reynolds portrait of John Hunter, lost in reverie, thinking thoughts that no other surgeon of that time, and perhaps no other surgeon since, has thought.